And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo, and we have a very informative show for you about rent regulation in New York City and the problems that people of the middle class and poor people have in keeping an apartment in this city. So stay tuned, and you're going to learn a lot. Our guests are City Councilwoman Helen Rosenthal, making a second appearance. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Khadijah Canns, also making her second appearance, and Sue Susman of SaveAffordableHousing.org in New York. And you'll see her website to get more information about a lot of the things we're going to be talking about during this this half hour. So maybe we should begin by talking about today's rent regulation rally that occurred at City Hall. And Helen Rosenthal, City Councilwoman, thanks for joining us. And I know you have a very busy schedule, so tell us what happened this morning.
Well, this morning, tenant advocacy groups and state elected officials and city elected officials came together to really kick off the campaign to strengthen the rent regulation laws, which will expire in June 2015. And I'll be honest with you, it was very exciting. There was a lot of coming together, which is great. Public Advocate Tish James spoke, the Speaker of the City Council spoke. There's definitely a lot of passion for strengthening the rent laws. We'll see what happens. These are really these laws are regulated by the state. What the city can do is, sort of on the edges, make life a little bit better for tenants. But the real fixes need to happen at the state.
Is there any possibility of, well, let's talk about rent regulation, what it really is, because actually, I've lived in Manhattan for all my adult life pretty much, so I know what it is, but many people just don't, and many people today aren't in rent regulator, in market rate housing, paying, and they have no idea that there's $2.5 million, as you said earlier. Tell us a little bit of what regulation is.
So rent regulation means that the tenants have certain rights, and these rights, for example, are that the tenant is entitled to a renewal lease, and that's a really big deal because it means that you can complain about something in your building and not get thrown out, right? You can complain about something. So you get a renewal lease. It is at an increase, or maybe even no increase if we get a rent freeze, that is set by the Rent Guidelines Board. And it also means that you have the right to succession, which means if family members are living with you for a couple of years or more, and you leave the apartment for any reason, they don't lose their homes. They can stay in that home.
Now that's different than rent control. And there's a lot of confusion. What is rent regulation versus rent control?
Rent control is for buildings that were built before 1947. Rent stabilization is buildings built basically before 1974. They're pretty similar, but in rent control, the tenants don't get a lease to sign. They just stay there. And they have a really hefty rent increase every year. It's about 7.5%. And they also have to pay every time the fuel costs go up, for example. In rent stabilization, you're pretty set on paying just the what your lease is. The thing that happens, though, so rent stabilization and rent control are both good. Most of the people in rent control are fairly elderly at this point, as is happening actually for people like me in rent stabilization.
Right.
There are a lot of issues with rent stabilization today, though, because of the fact that we have a lot of landlords that are trying to get rid of that system, and because of that, there's a lot of harassment techniques that are going on. Harassment techniques that happen in my own building are things like they send threatening emails to tenants when a lease...
What's a threatening email?
For instance, they will say to people, under rent stabilization, you're not allowed to have dual residences, and or live in another residence for a certain amount of months. And a lot of tenants come to us because of the fact that our management likes to hire private eyes to look into their lives or not, because a lot of the allegations are untrue. But we've had some instances where tenants have been told that they live in another residence or they have another place other than the apartment they're living in. And that would be a reason to kick the person out, to evict them. The problem with that is, even if you are honestly living in only that apartment and the allegations are untrue, you spend so much time fighting that, fighting the landlord. You have to go to court over and over again just to prove that you are only living in that, apartment or whatever allegations they're coming up with. And so there are a lot of people who lose time at work. I mean, these are people that have to go to work because they have to pay their bills for that very same apartment. So, you just have various harassing techniques such as that.
Right. And one of the things that happens that Khadijah was just talking about is that the burden is always on the tenant. That the landlord can make some allegation, the tenant has to hire a lawyer. The landlord decides to get what's called a major capital improvement, something like a new roof that affects the whole building, and the tenant association or the tenants have to pay a lawyer to fight that. And so the burden is always on the tenant. And if the landlord, for example, takes an empty apartment and then claims that it's deregulated, the burden is on the next tenant who moves in, who's just moving into this apartment with great excitement, to read the fine print on the lease and say, oh, I should hire a lawyer and I should hire an engineer to prove that this apartment should not have been deregulated.
And that's a perfect example where we need the state to strengthen the laws, where the city council, we can't tell the state, to strengthen the laws to make sure that apartments are not deregulated like that. Only the state can do it. And for Khadijah's example, where the burden of proof is on the tenant, again, we need the state to come in and to have stronger rent laws to protect the tenants.
And what is the state? How is the state? The state of New York is much more conservative than the city of New York.
Absolutely, and that's the problem.
It doesn't. It does not rely. They don't rely on the votes of 2.5 million rent-stabilized tenants.
And that's the issue we're finding, is that, yes, the city government, city council, is more sympathetic to our views. Unfortunately, the state is not. Even the governor, I haven't heard him speak that much about rent regulation, or I hear him speak more about, bringing in foreign businesses to, I think, start up New York to improve the economy of New York. But at the same time, we have these other issues that need to be addressed. And I feel like the state government is more concerned about what happens in the rest of, upstate New York rather than the city itself.
I think the problem is actually more, you're right, you're absolutely right, but it's also more serious, and that is that the Real Estate Board of New York and its members have...
That's the landlord lobbyists.
The landlord lobbyists
exactly.
have contributed enormous sums of money, whatever they legally can, to upstate Republicans. For example, Catherine Young, who has been head of the State Senate Housing Committee, has no tenants. She has a whole lot of cows, but not a single tenant. And so when they give money to her for her campaign, she has no reason to vote for tenants. She has money from the Real Estate Board of New York, from the landlord lobby, and no tenants to be accountable to. So the accountability is an issue, but we're not sure that that's even something that's on the table at this point. What is on the table, we hope, is trying to get the law changed so that we stop the hemorrhage of affordable housing. We've lost 400,000 units since 1994. We have roughly 1 million left. It's not going to take very long to lose the rest.
And Mayor Giuliani during his, I remember in the early 90s, wasn't there a tremendous move towards making it easier to deregulate, to put like caps, income caps? It seemed like $200,000 was a lot, but in a New York City for a family, two people struggling to raise a family, $200,000 really isn't that much anymore.
Right.
And yet that's the minimum now.
Right. Well, the way it works is in an occupied apartment, if the tenant's household income is $200,000 for 2 years, and the rent is $2,500 or more, then the landlord can deregulate the apartment. The problem really comes, there aren't so many apartments, maybe 5% of apartments get deregulated because of income, but 95% get deregulated because they're empty. Let's say the rent was $1,000 or $1,500 a month, and the landlord suddenly claims that he's done enough work to raise the rent to $2,500, and nobody checks.
Right, and Khadijah's example is perfect. So a landlord will basically harass out a tenant in one of the ways that you discussed, and then the new tenant coming in is completely unaware.
And on top of that, it becomes a hotel system. It becomes a situation where, in my building in particular, we have a lot of people that come into an apartment. It was initially a rent-regulated apartment. They do, as Sue was saying earlier, they do have the ability to keep that as a rent-regulated apartment. Unfortunately, I've spoken to some tenants who said there's so much paperwork. It is a really difficult thing to fight for. So they'll place a tenant as a market rate tenant there for a little while, and then they turn it over somehow. It becomes a market rate apartment because once that tenant leaves, then the next tenant pays a higher rent. So they're always winning in this kind of a situation.
And it's in fact their business plan. Right? It's their business plan. They've said this on television programs that what they want is a shifting body of young professionals with 4 or 5 people sharing an apartment, which has to be, in my building, for example, the rent-regulated rents are in the range of $700 to $1,000 because we fought hard to keep those rents low. And the market rate apartments are $4,600, $5,000 a month.
For the same apartment.
For the same line. They may have improved it, and the stove sure looks nicer, but not that many thousands of dollars nicer.
Well, they're not luxury apartments in the way that one would think of a luxury apartment. They make these kind of incidental type of improvements, and it's a nicer looking stove. One tenant of ours had a refrigerator that was right next to the door, so he couldn't actually physically open his front door in his refrigerator. It was a kind of awkward. He physically, there was some kind of a structure that made it, and this was considered an improvement. Right. There was a family that ended up moving away from our building because a lot of them are paying a lot more money for these apartments, and the apartments are just they're not conducive to a family. So if you have a family of 3, for instance, you don't have cabinets that can hold that much food. Why are you living there? You'd rather live somewhere else. So it's the kind of place that was designed for, like you were saying, maybe some college students to live inside of who might not mind going out to dinner every day.
And I think if we live here in the city, we've all seen that, and we see that that's what's happening. And the sad part of that is that, if you talk to an old timer, somebody, like my parents who grew up in the Bronx and Brooklyn back in the 30s and 40s, and they tell you all the problems that New York had in those days, and one of the wonderful things that it was about was this community and sense of community. That you had neighborhoods, that you had people who knew each other, that you had people who watched out for each other, that New York was world famous for its diverse communities and neighborhoods. And now, I live in the Lower East Side, which was one of the great neighborhoods of New York for hundreds of years, and it's now a hotel zone.
Right. Well, where Khadijah and I live a few blocks apart on the Upper West Side, and for 20 blocks there were what were called Mitchell-Lama buildings, named after 2 state legislators, Mitchell and Lama, and those were roughly the most, more or less, I'm not sure exactly, but some of the most diverse buildings in the United States, ethnically and even in terms of income. And that was terrific. And people who earned more than a certain amount of money paid a surcharge, and that supported the people who could pay less. And so we all knew each other, and it was great. Now what's happening is that our buildings are becoming whiter, they're becoming wealthier, they're becoming a whole lot younger, which is fine. I like kids. But when we had our Halloween table out there this year, there was nobody there to take the candy, because while a lot of people are having babies, they can't afford to stay.
Once they have the babies, they move out.
They move out, and so and the babies don't eat candy, which is a good thing for the babies. But
obviously, a lot of people wanted it to be this way. It's been this way, and there was a lot of struggle in my community in the Lower East Side around this, and this is where a lot of the folks who wanted this years ago are now kicking themselves, saying maybe what the crazies were saying was more correct than they think.
I think that's exactly it. I mean, what Sue's talking about are established communities. I mean, Khadijah, did you grow up in your home? This is your family home, right?
Absolutely.
And it was a converted Mitchell-Lama building?
It was Mitchell-Lama.
Right. And so there was a point in time when Mitchell and Lama got together to pull this together, but they didn't have the foresight to think into perpetuity. I mean, I think that one of the big changes that Mayor de Blasio is looking for is that with the creation of new affordable housing, that it be kept affordable into perpetuity, in practice and well financed, so we don't end up, so we can create communities and then not end up.
I think also they received tax abatements for when they created a lot of these buildings, and that kind of went away after it was a contracted thing that
we're getting tax abatements to bring industry
years.
into the city. We're getting tax abatements to bring luxury into the city in order to increase the tax base. All well and good, but we've lost the tax base for the middle class people, for the more struggling segments of our society.
Well, I think again, this administration wants to extend those tax breaks and wants to reach out to buildings to let them know. The problem is that the economic incentives are such that this landlord in Khadijah's situation thinks they can make more money not doing that and instead evicting tenants out. And there's really got to be a sea change. These properties are not easily changed to luxury apartments the way that your landlord is advertising, these apartments with a kitchen, with a refrigerator door that bumps into the front door.
How about in housing court? I mean, to me, it would seem like a lot of this could be stopped if the judges in housing court put an end to it.
Well, only 10% of the tenants who go into housing court are represented by a lawyer.
And 90% or 98% of landlords are represented by a lawyer.
So there's a disconnect.
I mean, there are some bills. There are some bills that are being proposed now that would help that end of it a little bit. And one bill I know that Councilmember Mark Levine is proposing would say that tenants who are whose household income doesn't exceed 200% of the poverty level would be entitled to a lawyer in housing court, and that does help. And if that passes, that would be a big help. But it wouldn't be the whole thing, because tenants have to be strong to stand up against the landlord who calls on, as happened in our building, and who called on Thanksgiving weekend and said, I have information that you have a home someplace else, and if you don't take $40,000 to move, we're going to take you to court, and you're going to miss many days of work in court.
Right, and this is going back. I mean, this is nothing new. I mean, this is back in the 1980s when I first came to New York City, we had this problem, and worse. Direct threats: get out or else.
Right.
Now, why can we put a stop to that kind of behavior?
The way to stop it is to stop the motive for it. The motivation is that you can take a vacant apartment and take it out of rent regulation. If you couldn't take a vacant apartment out of rent regulation, there would be no more motivation to get the tenant in there out. And you can still make a profit, because if a landlord isn't making an 8% return on investment in a rent-regulated apartment, they can go to the state housing agency. They can say, here are my books. You can see I'm not making an 8% profit, and they'll give them a rent increase. But landlords don't like to do that, because, in fact, they're making 8%. What they want is more than that. And you don't get that from a bank. You don't get that in a lot of places these days.
Well, and to Sue's point, similarly, if the vacancy deregulation were not allowed, more landlords would take up the city on its offer to extend the affordability and take rent breaks again. Which the city is offering to them.
I was just thinking, on top of that, I do think we're living in a new world, a new environment where there's more of a push towards, many landlords are pushing towards, again, the young. They are trying to rent to the young people who come not necessarily from New York State. They're no longer trying to get money from us. They don't feel like they're going to make much of an income from renting to us. So
us being the longtime New Yorkers,
absolutely,
from, families have been here for a long time and been part of these communities that were set up.
They feel like they can make more money off of someone who's going to stay there for maybe a few months and just keep.
Right. I have many good friends who are
turning
from all over
apartments
America to live here, and they never live here for very long.
Right.
It's too
They
expensive.
come here, they have a good time, and they're great friends, but they're not like the friends I had back when I first moved here who were around for 20 years.
Right, because people can't afford to stay.
Right.
So it's a very serious issue, and it's going to keep happening unless we can get Albany to change that basic law, to repeal vacancy deregulation, and the bill that proposes that would actually re-regulate some of the apartments that were taken out under that same provision. And that would be a good thing, and that would be a way to keep some of those million apartments, because keeping affordable apartments is a whole lot cheaper than building new ones.
So that's in Albany right now.
That's in Albany right now.
What's happening? What's happening with the bill? This bill that we're discussing. Who promoted? Who's presenting it? Do we know who's presenting it? And where does it stand? Is it in the Assembly? Is it in the Senate?
Well, it was presented by Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal, not Helen Rosenthal, who does wonderful things in the city, but Linda Rosenthal, who does wonderful things in the state assembly. And I believe it's Andrea Stewart-Cousins in the state senate. And we're waiting for the January term to see what will happen. We're not real optimistic about the Senate doing positive things by itself, because it's controlled now by the GOP, which is primarily anti-tenant. However, we know from practice over the past many, 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 many years that laws in Albany are actually made by 3 men in a room. And those 3 men are Governor Cuomo, Speaker Sheldon Silver of the New York State Assembly, which is primarily Democratic, and Dean Skelos, who's the Senate Majority Leader, the state Senate Majority Leader. And if we can get 2 out of 3, we can get a decent deal. So what we really want to do is we want to get a caucus, we want to get some state assembly members who are willing to work with Shelley Silver and say, this has to be something that we're not going to give up on. We can't keep losing so many homes.
Where should the pressure? Where we have an audience, I don't know how many people are out there, maybe some tenants and renters are there and want to know, where should they send their letters, where should they send their cards, where should they send their emails?
Well, I was just going to say, as Sue said before, on the landlord side, they have a lot of money. But on the tenant side, we have the people. And what people need to do is, rally again for this fight. They need to gear up, organize, building by building. Tenant associations need to come out and fight at the state level. They need to contact their state representatives, state senators, and assembly people. They need to reach out to Governor Cuomo. And, they should really, there are a couple of websites that they can go to where they can learn about rallies and the people power places.
So
your website is one of those.
Yeah, so it's
SaveAffordableHousing.org. Save Affordable Housing. There it is. SaveAffordableHousing.org.
Yes, that's it.
Very good.
So on the right side of that, there's a calendar that shows all the different tenant activities that are going on and rallies. But if you click on the top of it, there's something that says the state laws that we need for 2015, and that describes the laws that we need, and both at the top and the bottom of that, you can click and you can see draft letters to Governor Cuomo and to Speaker Silver with addresses, and you can print them out and send them to all of your, to them, and have your neighbors do the same.
Right.
And what we did at our Halloween table, while we didn't send much, get rid of much candy, we did fill out about 100 postcards to Governor Cuomo, and that's a good thing. And if you can collect postcards, or talking to you right now, that's right. So toward the top, on the left, it says 2015, right. state legislative policies, and you can click on the thing that says Governor Cuomo or Assembly Speaker Silver, and you will see a letter. But you have to click on Cuomo or Silver to see the actual above that. Yeah, to the right, click on Cuomo's Governor Cuomo. Yes.
There you go.
Yeah, there it is. Good. Okay, and there's the place
And
to
there's
go.
a letter, and you can actually see a letter.
This is great.
That you can send, and there's one for Governor Cuomo, and there's one for Sheldon Silver, and we have to make them our allies in this, and they have to understand that we as the voters are not going to tolerate their letting things slide so that we lose more and more apartments.
And these kind of issues, letters and cards, phone calls, emails, they have an effect.
Oh, I have to tell you, as a newly elected official, you know, when my inbox is flooded with emails and our box is filled with letters, we hear from people. And it makes a real impression. And we also sort out the opinions, pro and con, and we're tracking that stuff regularly. So any responsible legislator is doing the same.
It's important that everybody go out. Anybody who feels like this is even the slightest issue in their life should go out, check the website, saveaffordablehousing.org, and check for the rallies that are happening or sending out these letters. I know a lot of people who say it's important to them, but they don't take that extra step. So it's always important to do that.
Right, Senate, it's what's a postcard, 24 cents?
Absolutely.
48 cents?
34.
34 cents for a postcard. It's worth the 34 cents. It's the best. If you're a rent-stabilized tenant, I'll tell you this, I'm a poli-sci major, we're sitting with a city council person, a housing activist, a lawyer. Send these cards and letters. They have an effect on these kind of issues.
And there are groups, there are coalitions of tenant organizations that are working for this and that know how to do this also. And so you have tenants and neighbors, you have Met Council on Housing, you have coalitions like the Real Rent Reform.
Right.
Right,
Oh,
Met
yeah?
Council is,
Yeah, sure.
right. And you have the Real Rent Reform campaign, which is one coalition. You have Tenants, I'm forgetting the name, but it's on my website, Tenants Alliance. You have Make the Road New York. These groups are experienced at it, and if you join one of those groups as an individual or as a tenant association, you can help. You can get started, and they'll tell you about the rallies, and they will help people to put pressure on our elected officials and make sure they respond.
It's key. If there's one message that we're trying to get out to your viewers today is get engaged.
All right,
Get
thank you very
engaged.
much, everybody, for joining us. We had a great show. Wonderful.